Hello all, and this is going to be a bit of a discussion video on Aristotle and the politics. Um, I know we're kind of jumping around a bit, but I figured this would actually be a pretty uh, interesting one to do considering it's a classical civilizational founding text. And there's a lot of ideas that I think maybe are worth considering um, over time in comparison to the Greeks, as compared to how we kind of see these things today, like concepts like virtue. Like virtue has such a dirty meaning now in our kind of circle on the right, but virtue is very important. Love is very important, and these kind of classical texts, these pre-liberal, uh, modern texts, kind of get back to these fundamentals. The Greeks were known for their psychology and how they were able to describe the condition. And Aristotle obviously is one of the heavyweights at that. And if we're kind of preface this and kind of admire for a second at this these foundational texts that Aristotle gives us as the kind of father of political science, he's obviously forming a kind of synthesis of everything. Everything kind of comes together. The politics doesn't come first, which is kind of actually controversial in our time. In this kind of tabula rasa, you're just kind of independent of everything. The ethics ends and the politics begin for Aristotle, quite literally in his kind of work canon. And you can kind of see that from the start, the polis, the Greek city state as we would call it, is a reflection of these kind of combined households, these relationships, where he kind of talks about the household and why you have to have a different kind of authority and different kind of way of considering these relationships, actually to do with the subject at hand, as opposed to kind of just applying this functionality to it of what's the benefit for me, how's this gonna, or even in a kind of zero sum way, which we don't really which we frown upon on this channel. It's way more complicated than just some zero sum political endeavor. There's a lot of back scratching, and the kind of views of history of everything from warfare. There's no spirituality to this, and I guess understanding these kind of terminology is going to be important going forward in this video, because we're going to be kind of talking about concepts like master and slave and whatnot, and we have to understand that slavery isn't just about lack of pay for some work. It's intuitively we all know this about like the condition of culturally, when we kind of still reference not being a slave to something, not being a slave to consumerism. That's like a big thing on our kind of end, I think. Understanding moderation, which is, I think, is very big in Aristotle, of course. And I think if you take something like the province that I talk about a lot, and you're kind of seeing more and more people mention it. Not saying that I'm influencing that or anything, but I think collectively we kind of become more and more aware of these kind of things over time, and the kind of want to get away from civilization itself and the technological prospects of actually being able to do that, especially in this kind of post-lockdown. We kind of understand that we can actually hunker down, but that is actually a crisis in and of itself. That I think if you could take away from this text, what's the point of caring about the polis, the greater community, if you can just hide behind technology? But that's that's false though, because obviously a community, or in this case a polis that crumbles around you, your technology is not going to mean much if you're under siege, quite literally. And so there is that kind of sense that maybe this is a false pretense to kind of use, but ultimately, pragmatically, I think this is part of the process to kind of get away from the decentralize away from civilization. And maybe there is that kind of want, as I've talked about, of maybe forming our own kind of city states. But to kind of go back around, and I did quite a ramble there. I think the polis, as I've talked about, is one of the main ideas that you could really take away from the politics, and how he kind of sees the synthesis of people and their relationships actually going in tandem with the greater community at hand. And I think this is one of the fundamentals to get at when we talk about private ownership and kind of that sort of history of it. Private ownership now is, kind of owning some sort of business, or playing part in some bureaucracy, or owning stocks in some abstract, corporation that, at this point doesn't even have like a brick and mortar store, right? Most of these are just these kind of online vectors. Even they don't even really exist in a concrete fashion anymore. And so when you talk about something like a polis, for example, this seems like almost like a foreign language to kind of understand. Ownership is more about someone actually putting into their community, or of honing something and giving back towards a people that they would love to actually give back to, and not in this kind of utility, well, all money's good money, and sort of that attitude that we see today, or even understanding where most of your money's even coming from. That you have like such anonymous and ways of doing these sort of things, these kind of interactions now. So it's kind of interesting to maybe think about, I think the idea of like capital, or a market is much different in this kind of classical sense. But I think it is, worth considering that just because we're struggling in modernity with these kind of classic almost rituals that founded us, seem kind of co-opted or unrecognizable to us now. But I think going back to these sort of traditional understandings, and maybe looking at where was the kind of peak and valley of what was good about it, and how it could go wrong, is one of the things to maybe consider if you want to look at this text. And I think could be also an interesting aside to point out how Aristotle, to me at least, is sort of the original defense of the middle. We talk about high-low versus middle a lot on this channel, and I think it's worth considering that kind of in the aristocracy, if you will, is one of the references that a lot of these kind of historical perspectives of high-low versus middle make, and I think that's dead on, and you can kind of sense the origins here in this text, because he talks about how important it is to kind of have this middle class, this thriving middle. And I think another thing that's refreshing about this is he understands that flourishing, you have to actually have this kind of thriving, almost, harmony, and I hate to keep saying this word, but literal synthesis among your community, and this commonality among them. This is why he talks about how like the Greek city-state should exhibit and show the properties of that actual people, and it's just such a stark contrast to compare to what is going on in our contemporary time with, I think we have an elite class that actively seeks to try to disenfranchise and alienate these sort of Polis attitudes that could seep through. And this never-ending shifting of people and these abstract, political parties that kind of encompass everything and really bog us down and take away ultimately our attributes. That's one of the main critiques really of democracy that I would also cling to. But Aristotle also, it kind of just shows how much democracy is just based in this kind of ritualistic attitude of it's the best that we've got because it's the least violent, or at least that's what we've been told for so long. And I think part of that understanding of democracy, like if you're gonna have this kind of mass enclave, these mass assumptions to make, and you're ultimately kind of liquefying the individual in a kind of like real sense of what they actually are comprised of, and you have to push that aside to kind of try to find these universal attributes that really don't mean much if you just look at them beyond their, if you just have a quantity of them, then you just write them all down separately. It's pretty incoherent. Like there's nothing reflecting or a sense of identity that like Aristotle kind of offers us through the ethics and the politics, and how ethical people can come together and create this kind of science of understanding what it means to flourish together. And you're not going to see that in America because we're always kind of shifting, always changing, always going through these different identities because we have to pick and choose them because you're this autonomous person who is thrown into this world, and you're just kind of at it all by yourself. And I think if we were going to shift now and really get at the contemporary critiques of things, we'd have to talk about the pretty taboo chapter, if you will, if any philosophical student was to look through these the politics and its volumes, and that's the slave and the master. And he's going beyond, obviously, just this sort of attitude of getting paid to do something. And in contemporary times today, the wage cuck meme and the Wojak who's just trying to make it or make a quick buck to kind of get out of this kind of serfdom, even though he's paid, lucratively in comparison to his, boomer parents or whatever the case may be, or just the dirt poor conditions of the Great Depression compared to now 100 years later. I think it would be pretty self-serving to just suggest that there obviously isn't some kind of change with the relativeness of that, but still nonetheless we kind of have this existential crisis of just being this sort of serf. And we kind of went over this in here lately with the warrior class and Evola and the Aztecs and whatnot, but I think if we were to get to the nit and gritty of things, it's understanding that these kind of like caste systems that the traditional thinkers were pointing out, it's kind of that intuitive, only when the state of exception happens, if you will, is when you're really going to actually understand the kind of the essence of the truth, if you will, to these things. It's these hostile situations and anxiousness and actually being pushed or provoked in a way that you actually understand who is the imitator and who's actually the master. And in many such cases, I'll tell my own kind of, I'll lay it out on my own. I definitely have this kind of um, slavish kind of feeling towards things that are kind of outside what I'm used to, and I'm just kind of this stuffy, philosophically interested kind of bookworm at heart, and outside of that, I think I'm extremely incompetent, and I think my close friends and family would totally agree with that. Like I'm pretty incompetent outside of my little frame of interests, and understanding that, and ultimately knowing that if I was like faced with a situation of having to do something outside of these things, I'm very much inclined to probably just follow who I would trust in that kind of situation, and that's kind of being understanding the kind of creative minority that's necessary to have knowledge to give in this kind of way that you could perceive it as slavish, because you're just being this kind of follower. You're following this creative minority towards something, or at least entrusting them in a way that kind of comes off in this kind of, well, he's the master and I'm beneath him. And it is also worth pointing out that as we've been kind of delving into this individual conception of modernity that we all have for each other, that ultimately I don't need any of these people. Like I could just give the middle finger to anyone, your own parents or your family, at any time, because I'm just this autonomous creature. I'm this individual, and I'm gonna know what's best for myself. But I can't use that on anyone else, because it would be hypocritical, and that's not really how life works, though. You're constantly taking knowledge and advice from other people and appropriating that accordingly. And just because it stands out to you doesn't really mean that you think you have autonomy over it. It's much more complex than that. And in a way, in this kind of hyper modern world we live in, there's no sense of like if you don't need anyone beneath you. You don't need anyone above you. You definitely have a enclivity against who's above you, because authority overall, at least to us, is just a joke now. There's no respect behind actual authority in America, at least at the present time, if ever, honestly. And when you have that, you're going to end up with a lot of hang-ups on who's actually in charge, and only the true efforts of the creative minority, in spite of all of everything that's happening around them. It's actually we actually stand in their way more often than not in this kind of system that we have, that I think actually holds us back in that sort of way. But I think, to kind of put a bow on this one, I think it's worth maybe taking something in the Heideggerian sense of de-worlding and applying this to the polis, and understanding how technology really kind of gets in the way of this kind of polis that I think intuitively we're all looking to get. I think what you might romanticize out of these texts is how the polis is supposed to be a reflection of yourself in that kind of way. And for us in America, that's just totally unrecognizable. That, in fact, that would be looked down upon, I think, in our kind of cultural zeitgeist of how our kind of myths and historical understandings of like just constant revolution and constant antagonism towards each other. Harmony is not very profitable in that kind of sense. And that is something that Aristotle also brushes up on, and why I think it's so important to maybe look at capital more in this kind of Aristotelian sense, as opposed to this global capital that we have now. There is pride in ownership. You should have, ownership in the Polis. But it needs to be actually, actually real, and there actually needs to be, kind of a grounding towards it, and not just this kind of, oh, well, I'm just gonna bump and sit around on these stocks for a while, and then I'm just gonna depart one day, or I'm gonna shortfall this company and actually, root for its demise, or root against the workers even, and whatever the case may be. And yeah, just to kind of summarize things, I think it is the understanding of how far we've really deviated from our ancient ancestors, and how the polis is not even as recognizable as your most rural and conceived wholesome town in America, even with this kind of de-worlded technology. And it's kind of interesting, just as a closing kind of in the now kind of analogy, where everyone's kind of weighing in on Israel and Palestine in America right now. And, for the most part, if any of us were caught walking down the street, we probably wouldn't want to make eye contact with each other. And, what's the more prevalent, issue at hand really for us is it that, the kind of trust system that America was built on has totally been eroded, or this conflict that none of us truly understand really, or have any historical rooting towards, other than whether you want to go down the kind of like bloodlines, and I guess there is immigration, so there is that kind of aspect to it. We are kind of actually provoked in this kind of, since we are this kind of global people, we actually do have to care about these conflicts, I suppose. But we are actually subjugated to that as Aristotelian middle, defenders, I think, in that kind of sense. But yeah, I think I covered everything that I wanted to. I was just kind of browsing back, and I think I want to do maybe more of these kind of classical foundational texts, and if you really want to kind of go beyond this kind of liberal order, you obviously have to go back through history, predating it, to understand some of its critiques and how people were even seeing it before it was even budding. And their critiques are some of the most important to actually take in of all. But yeah, I think this is a satisfactory video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys for the next one.